All right, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Dan Thompson, and I'm your host for today's webinar. That's me there. Before today's presentation, I just have a few logistics to knock out. So first and foremost, this is the question we get the most often. Today's presentation is being recorded. It will be distributed to attendees after the event. Secondly, there are a few Zoom features we'll be using today, and I just would like to, and we'd love your participation. So I'm going to point out the features we're using. The Q&A feature, which is to the far left there, that's for any questions you may have for our presenter, Austin, today. I'll share them at the end of the presentation, unless you ask a really topical one. Austin has been great in giving me permission to interrupt him to make sure we get those at the right time. We'll make sure, again, we save time at the end, though, for all Q&A. Secondly, we have a few poll questions today. While you don't have that little polling tab on your screen, they will automatically pop up on your screen at the appropriate time. We'd greatly appreciate your participation in those as well. And finally, the chat feature, which is to the right, is just for general inquiries. So feel free to post anything in there that you'd like to share with the whole group. Finally, we would love to get social with today's event. So we'll be tweeting today using the hashtag that's on the bottom of the screen, using the handle at the bottom of the screen there. And of course, that's hashtag learning with Leo. To follow along and participate, if you just search for that hashtag in your search bar in Twitter, and then click on the word latest, it will show the latest tweets from us and your peers and you during this time. We really believe we learn best as a community, so we're always happy to hear your thoughts as well. So that's already enough from me. So I'm happy to get to the main event, which is Rebooting the Flipped Classroom, Best Practice Tips for Student Success in Traditional and Virtual Environments, presented by Austin Rutledge. Just a little bit about our presenter today. Austin has more than a decade of experience working in education, and he's passionate about working to improve student outcomes at every level of education. He's taught at every level from middle school to university courses, and spent the last 4 years working alongside faculty in every possible setting, and that includes primary grade classrooms, even to med school labs, in an effort to increase student engagement, like the flipped classroom, and improve retention. While much of Austin's expertise lies in technology integration, his focus is on finding the right pedagogical approach, regardless of the role technology may play. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn things over to our presenter today, Austin Rutledge.
Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate that. And you mentioned that last part about technology and the role technology plays. Well, yes, I love technology and how it can help facilitate student learning. It is important to always recognize that it's not about the technology first. It's really about the student learning. So we want to find the right tools, whether they're a tech tool or not. So always keep that in mind, especially as we talk about the flipped classroom. Today, we are really focusing on both flipped and virtual courses, so online classes as well as seated classes. And we'll talk about how we can even think about flipping those online classes as well. And so we'll be looking at some different ways and methods for doing that. And so yeah, let's get moving. Real quick, I always do like to get to know the audience. So I think Dan's going to throw up a poll. What's the weather like where you are? Here in Tulsa, it's actually sunny today. It was cloudy this morning, but it is not snowing anymore. It was snowing yesterday, but it is still pretty cold. So just curious to know what it's like where you are, and kind of get a pulse on our audience. So as you're responding to that, I just want to share kind of a quick story, thinking about my own experience with flipping the classroom. The first time I tried this, I do remember, I didn't get everything right. Definitely made a few mistakes along the way, and have learned from those. I remember one of the first times I flipped a classroom learning event. I, went through all the kind of the paces, and then once class was kind of nearing its end, I asked my students, well, what do you guys think about this? Do you like learning this way? And after class, I had a couple of students come up to me and say, Mr. Rutledge, this was pretty cool, but you kind of repeated a lot of the same stuff that we learned at home in class. And so it's like really an eye-opening, moment for me is like, if I'm going to ask my students to be responsible for, covering this stuff on their own at their own pace before class, then I really do need to respect that and, use that class time, not just to assume that, oh, they didn't do it. I need to really, trust and respect my students. So A quick tip from me, something I learned along the way is that I really have to let students have that ownership. Dan, how's the weather out there?
Yeah, so can you see that on your screen now, Austin?
I don't
Okay,
know.
I will gladly share. So most people are winning. We have a 50%, it's sunny, and another 37 that are dealing with some rain, and half are dealing with cold. Just a quick report, in Durham, we're dealing with tornado watches. So
Oh, wow.
take your sunny and cold right now.
I have had a webinar interrupted by a tornado warning before. Living in Oklahoma, that's not uncommon. So so let us know, Dan, if you have to step out. um, Man, I was hoping we'd get a lot of just rights, but maybe not this time of year. Um, all right, so back on topic, talking about different types of learning. Today, really, you can kind of fit learning into three kind of general categories: traditional, seated classrooms, like you see in the image here, and that's probably what a lot of us are used to, what a lot of us encountered when we were in our own courses back when we were still the learner. And today, we're really going to focus on the other two types, the online learning and the blended learning. So when we talk about online classes, this is a class where the students probably don't ever have any real face-to-face, real life contact with either the instructor or the other students in the class. Oftentimes, I know in some of the online classes I've taken personally, you kind of feel like you're in a silo. And sure, you get communications from the faculty, teaching the course, but there's never that back and forth discussion. So it's very different. You probably use, if you're taught or participated in an online class, you probably use some type of learning management system to help facilitate that. So that's one of the types of classes we'll be talking about today. The other is this blended learning model. And so when I say blended learning, that means that some of the learning happens in a kind of a seated classroom, face-to-face in real life, and the other part happens online. And so this graphic is from a book written by Michael Horn and Heather Staker called Blended. And in that book, they talked about all of these different models for blended learning. And the flipped classroom is really just one of these models, but it's the one that we're going to be focused on today. So as we get into talking about flipped classrooms, I am also, again, interested in our audience. So, have you utilized a flipped classroom before? What is your experience with that approach? Have you, obviously I would think we're all probably interested or we wouldn't be here, but, maybe you haven't tried it out yet. Maybe you do it, once a year or once every couple of years. Maybe you're doing flipping your classroom, on a regular basis, once or twice a semester, or maybe you do it all the time. Just, go ahead and respond. Think about that, respond to that poll. As you take some time to think about that, one of the other things that I've found with flipping the classroom is that oftentimes I will utilize lecture recordings. So I'll kind of video what I would normally do in class, sitting in my office, and I'll record that lecture video and share it with my students to watch ahead of time. And what I found actually that is really interesting is I can usually cut down what would normally be an hour's worth of content can be cut down in half or even more than in half. And I think some of the reasons for that is because when I'm recording that, knowing that we're going to have the in-class portion of class later on, I can remove a lot of those more meaty examples from my lectures. And also, I don't tend to get sidetracked as much. I don't get off on tangents, if a student asks a particular question. But what's great is that the students still get to ask those questions, and maybe we can go off on a few tangents that are really applicable to the learning, but we can do it in class, and it doesn't really interrupt the flow of the content as much. So, which is really nice with the flipped classroom approach. So, Dan, how many people out there do we have flipping the classroom?
So 43% of our group today has actually flipped the classroom somewhat regularly. We've just a few folks, 14% that frequently do it, also 14 that do it on rare occasions, and about 30% that don't currently do it but are interested 0% do it all the time.
Okay, cool. So we definitely have some people out there flipping, and we have some people here that I hope are, interested in learning more, maybe get some advice, some tips on how they could flip the classroom where they are. So let's talk more about this flipped classroom approach and really dig into what it is. I've given you a few examples, but let's talk more concretely about the flipped classroom. So the traditional approach, which I've mentioned already, is what you see here in this top of this diagram. And that's where students are introduced to a concept, in a particular, maybe a large group setting. It could be a lecture hall. It could be just a typical classroom. But the first time that they encounter that content, they're in a kind of a group setting. But it's maybe not a collaborative group setting because they're counting on the instructor to give them all of that content, right? Then they go home, and then that's the time where they have the ability to apply that knowledge. Maybe they're working through some problem sets or reading through some case studies, things like that. So that's kind of the traditional approach. With the flipped classroom approach, we kind of turn that on its head a little bit. And so now the students, they really have their own choice of how, where, and when they want to be introduced to those concepts. They can do it by themselves. They can find other students to work with if they have that ability. So the idea there is that they can do it at their own pace. And then you get into the classroom portion of the flipped classroom, and now the application of knowledge, this is where the real learning happens, in my opinion, is that they can work on applying that knowledge collaboratively. They're not applying it in a silo, sitting by themselves somewhere reading through case studies. They can do that in a group setting, counting on the knowledge and experience of their peers or being able to ask questions of the instructor. So that's one of the huge advantages of the flipped classroom. And so when you really break that down and think about, well, what do you do? How do you introduce the concepts if you don't spend all of the time lecturing with the students? How do you get that information to them? Well, there are actually a number of methods and things that you could do here. I know, honestly, from my experience, more of a low-tech option. When I was in graduate school, some of the best classes I took were courses where our instructor would assign us journal articles to read, and then we would show up to class, split up into groups, and we would just spend the whole class time discussing those articles. One of the really neat things that they would do is they would actually have one person in each group responsible for writing their own discussion questions. And we would rotate that responsibility each week, but it really got us involved in not just the content, but really, discussion of the content, extending the content beyond just what we read in the journal article, and maybe making some connections to bigger concepts. And there are, again, lots of other ways, whether you're just providing notes or outlines, handouts. You could do audio recording of a lecture or a video lecture, like I mentioned earlier. E-learning content is a really something I've been more interested in the last few years, and that is, using certain authoring tools to take some of that content and package it for the students. And, again, thinking of the same thing of, usually 30-ish minutes of content that they can work through. But with the e-learning tools, you're actually able to embed within that content opportunities for students to check their understanding. So you might throw in some short, low-stakes quiz questions or drag and drop activities, things like that. So that was a way that I saw some faculty recently facilitate a flipped classroom approach, is providing that content online ahead of time. And what's really great with certain learning management systems, I know Leo does this, you can actually monitor that learning content, and you can see, if the students are taking quizzes within that. And again, I do recommend low stakes quizzes or things of that nature. But you can actually check and see how they're doing working through that content before they ever show up to class. But the key to all of this, as you see on the screen, is that this does happen before the students show up for class. So students are completing this work ahead of time, and what's great is they can work through it at their own pace. I mentioned before that I cut, my lecture recordings really cut down on time because I could record them and post them online. And what I found is that students will actually, watch those multiple times, or they'll they can pause and rewind and listen to things over and over if it's not making sense to them. So it's one of the great things about this flipped approach is that they get all of that content in a way that they can digest it at their own pace. So the next part of the flipped classroom, we get into the application of knowledge. And so here, this is where it gets really fun. This is where you get to interact with your students more. I know when I started flipping the classroom, I felt like I formed a lot more relationships with my students because I was talking to them. I wasn't just talking, I was talking with them, not just talking to them. So the application of knowledge is a big part of the flipped classroom. And that's what happens in the seated portion of a blended classroom. And we're going to talk a little bit about flipped online classrooms in a minute, but just to understand this flipped model, what do you do during that time? Well, team-based learning is really fun, and I've seen students get really engaged with the team-based learning activities, especially when they're working together in groups. Problem-based learning is, a way to kind of extend that even further. And so you might have, really in-depth problems that students work through on more than one occasion, and they go home and they learn more. In that, individual environment, they come back and work again on the same problem within that group environment. So problem-based learning is really fun. But you can even, condense that down, and maybe they don't have the big problems like they might have with PBL, but they might, have short problems that they can work through within, a single setting. So that's a way that students can work through a single problem set within a particular hour or a particular session. So that's really fun too. I mentioned the discussion. That was one of the ways that I participated in flipped learning in my own education, and I found that really, really helpful to have those discussions in kind of like a Socratic seminar, if you will. Another thing that I've seen other schools do is they will actually present the content ahead of time, through a lecture recording or something like that, and they'll spend all the class time taking a particular case. You see this especially a lot in the health sciences, where they will take a case presentation and they will use all of that content students studied ahead of time, and they'll apply it to that case and talk about why this case happened the way it did. And they'll obviously that there's opportunities there for discussion within class in regards to that, and even involving the students and having the students participate and present the cases themselves, I think is a great way to think about flipping the classroom. One, I think, important tip that I would encourage you to take note of is that when you're flipping the classroom, that in-portion part of class really does need to have opportunities for students to formatively assess themselves and for you to formatively assess them as well, so that as faculty, how they're doing. And again, I would also encourage you to include some time for student reflection. So this kind of gets into that those metacognitive strategies you maybe have heard about recently in the med ed world specifically. I've seen metacognition mentioned quite a bit. So that's a helpful tip. I would encourage you, because that is really the in-class portion of the flipped classroom, is where they're going to recognize, hey, I understand this material, I'm really getting this. So I would really encourage you to think about including those. And again, with formative assessments, one of the keys for me when doing formative assessment of any kind is that, one, it's low stakes. So the students aren't stressed out or nervous or anxious about participating. And then it's a way for them to assess themselves, so they can recognize, do I get this information? It's also a way for the faculty to recognize, are the students understanding, and really kind of maybe redirect a little bit, provide further examples of things that they need to when they are covering or reviewing some of the material. And again, I think that student self-assessment is really critical. So that's, again, why the low stakes to me is an important component of formative assessment. So back to the flipped classroom, thinking of a more concrete example of what this might look like. Well, here's an example of the e-learning content that I talked about. So here's an example of that. And you can see this was, there's lots of actually content dropped throughout this. This is just one screenshot. So the students participated, and they watched some short videos, they looked through some notes, and then this was an example of an activity. They had to drag these examples to the correct location. So they're sorting through this information. And then when they get into the classroom, this is where the students are in groups and they're working through the content together. They're answering questions, maybe working through team-based learning components, whether it's individual readiness assessments or group readiness assessments, whatever that might be, they're working through those together. And so you see the collaborative nature of what that might look like. So that's an example of a blended approach to flipping the classroom, where you have the online component and then the brick and mortar, students are in class. So as you're thinking about flipping the classroom, especially those of you that have tried this approach, what are the obstacles that you guys face? Are you just not sure what to do? What do I do for the at-home part? What do I do for the in-class part? Maybe your students aren't coming prepared. Maybe that's a struggle that you're having. Maybe you don't like to see your students struggle and have difficulty with the content. If it's something else, throw it in the Q&A. Feel free to choose that and drop that in. And obviously, if you haven't tried it yet, that's fine. So, in thinking about this, as you guys think through this, I know for me personally, one of the successes I had with flipped learning is in a history course I was teaching one time. I decided, to kind of try something a little bit different, and I took one of the more difficult concepts. One of the areas in which my students really struggled typically on the final end of the year exam. So I took all of those concepts and I used a flipped classroom approach. And what I was really shocked is that the students, they didn't, blow it out of the water, but there was definitely improvement. It was a difficult concept. And when I tried that flipped approach, I saw a little bit more student success than I had in the past. And then even the next year, I saw that climb even further. So to me, that was telling me, that ability to talk about a concept, apply their knowledge with their peers, that was a big part of that student success, I believe. So Dan, what about our audience? What are the things that they struggle with?
Yeah, it's a great question, Austin. So 40% both have similar issues. One, their students aren't prepared, and we have something else. So hopefully we'll get some Q&As there. So I appreciate that. 13% haven't tried it yet. So, they'll learn some of these firsthand. And then another 25% are just in that boat of just not sure exactly what to do.
Yeah, sure. I know students not coming prepared is something I'm always a little bit worried about. I've done different things to combat that. Sending reminders and kind of over communicating with your students as to what is expected and when definitely makes a big difference. And then, as you try this, as students maybe get used to a new model, they'll probably kind of change, they have to change their habits as well. So recognizing that, maybe being a little bit empathetic of the students' course load, and maybe even providing them a little bit of extra time outside of class to prepare. There's multiple ways we can talk about that. And again, if you have more questions about that, drop that in the Q&A, and we're happy to discuss that when we get to the end of the webinar today. All right. So let's talk now about flipping the online classroom. So we're going to shift gears a little bit, and now we're not talking about a brick and mortar, seated environment that we're flipping. We're talking about those virtual courses, and you're seeing these more and more. I know there's so many different platforms out there on the web these days where you can go and learn pretty much anything, and even a lot of universities are getting into the online classroom, or what I think they call it MOOCs, M-O-O-C. Multiple open online courses. So it's a growing trend. And so with the online approach, you're going to see this a little bit differently. So the traditional online approach, you see where the students are introduced to the concepts kind of on their own. They don't really even have peers around them. Even if it is a similar way that they're getting the content, they don't have anybody around them to even look at or ask questions of. And then the application of knowledge, again, is still kind of in that same boat. There's not a lot of peer interaction. So the flipped classroom, the flipped online classroom, is again taking this approach of using this time to have students interact with their peers and interact with the instructor a little bit more. And so we'll talk about some strategies for doing that. First of all, for introducing students to the concept, nothing is really much different here than you might have seen with a brick and mortar blended flipped classroom. You still have, because it's all happening online, and so you still have the opportunity to assign reading and text and things like that. And then you could do those same lectures or audio recordings as well. I would encourage you to think about, whether you're flipping an online classroom or blended classroom, you can still use a lot of the same content. The difference for an online approach really happens in that second portion of the flipped classroom. And so that's where you can take some of those things we did before, and you can still utilize that approach, but you really have to consider, is this going to happen at a specific time, or is it going to happen asynchronously? So are all the students going to be online together at the same time, along with the instructor, or is there learning this application of knowledge? Is it going to happen in an asynchronous environment where one person might be online today and a few others tomorrow? How is that going to look? So in thinking about that, we really need to consider the role that technology is going to play. And again, like I said earlier, I'm a big fan of integrating technology into education. I think it can really enhance the things that we can do with and for our students. But we need to, again, always make sure that we're using the right tool for the right reasons and not just using technology for technology's sake. So when you're thinking about that, how are you going to do synchronous online learning? So for example, if you want your students to have those discussions of a journal article or discussing the lecture recording that you posted online, how are you going to do that? Well, fortunately, there are a lot of video conferencing systems out there today that have the opportunity for you to create many of them call breakout rooms. And so I was talking to a colleague of mine recently, and she was explaining how in one of her graduate courses, they utilize these breakout rooms all the time. And so I was thinking, oh, that's great. People are already doing these types of things. So, the idea here is that you could have students join a video conference, much like you guys are all doing today, and you can split those participants out into multiple breakout rooms. And so they can then communicate with each other. They could all turn on their own video and their own microphone and talk and discuss the content. And then you could bring them back into the kind of the main room and debrief. And what's really nice is I've actually seen where the instructor can hop around from one breakout room to another. Students even have the ability, in some that I've seen, I think Zoom does this. By the way, I believe the free version of Zoom even allows this, is that students in those breakout rooms can raise their hands. They can hit a button, and the instructor will see, oh, there's a group that's asking a question. And so the instructor can hop into that breakout room and discuss that with the students and then hop back to another one if they need to. So some really cool stuff that you can do with breakout rooms, but you don't have to rely on that. You could also rely on online chat and messaging apps. Things like Slack or Google Hangouts, or, there's lots of other online tools and ways that students and faculty can communicate with each other. And then as well as using some of these collaborative authoring apps that are out there. So, I'm thinking of some of the Office tools that you might see in things like Office 365 or Google Apps for Education, G Suite for Education. Some of those tools allow students, faculty, whoever is joining, to actually collaborate and work on a document or a slideshow or spreadsheet. They can do that in unison all at the same time and see those changes that are being made in live time. So really interesting ways that you could think about having students work collaboratively at the same time online. When it comes to asynchronous online learning, there are also, you could utilize some of those same tools as far as those messaging apps. the idea there is that you just know that not everybody is online at the same time. So you might pose a question, but you might have to revisit it to see somebody's response to that. Discussion boards are another great way that you can utilize even your own LMS to do that. I know Leo supports discussion boards. Social, like we're doing today, we're kind of doing social in more of a synchronous setting, but social could also be used asynchronously. So you could create a hashtag for your course. Again, using those same authoring apps. One that I'm really a big fan of is Flipgrid. And if you guys haven't seen Flipgrid, I would really encourage you to check that out. My favorite thing about Flipgrid is that it's completely free, and they've committed to stay completely free. And they don't even have a paid platform. It's a really cool tool. And what's great about Flipgrid is you can take a Flipgrid and you can embed it within your learning management system. Or you can just link right to it from your learning management system, however you want to do it. But with Flipgrid, what students are going to do is probably use their smartphones or their laptop computers, and they're going to create video responses to questions that the instructor might pose. So that's a way for you to asynchronously communicate and discuss a topic within your courses. So again, going back to an example from earlier, an online example of a flipped classroom is we're going to take the same e-learning content I discussed earlier, but now instead of the students getting together in person in groups, now we might be using breakout rooms, or we might be using chat apps or presentations, your learning management systems to do some of the same things. And again, this is going to happen online. That's why we put this nice little cloud out here. But that's the idea of an online approach. So